to welcome everyone to the June Linea webinar. And today, ECPAT International is joining us to share findings from their global study of the sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. I'm Rebecca Mikeson. I'm with the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation, and Abuse, or Linea. And we're excited to say that for the very first time, we are co-hosting and co-sponsoring a webinar with another center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and that's the March Center. So I'd like to quickly introduce Dr. Shin-Mei Young, who will say a few words about the March Center and about their work.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. So I'm Shin-Mei Young, as Rebecca said, and I'm one of the co-leads for the child theme of the March Center, which stands for Maternal, Adolescent, Reproductive and Child Health. And so our center's been going over for about 4 years. It's quite a new center, and very much interested in bringing people within the school and from outside of the school into kind of an interdisciplinary discourse around the whole life course, from maternal through the neonate, child, adolescent, and back through the adult. So it's a real privilege. So thank you very much for inviting us to co-host this webinar.
Thank you very much. And so now I have another introduction to make. I'd like to introduce Alice McAlpine, who we're very excited to welcome to the Linea team. And Alice, I'm going to be passing things over to Alice to host this webinar, and she'll be the host of future Linea webinars as well. So I'm going to hand things over to Alice now to say a few words about Linea and about the webinar series itself, and to introduce today's presenters.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, and welcome again, everyone, to this Linea webinar, which will be looking at the recent global study conducted by ECPAT International addressing the sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. As many of you know, Linea is the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation, and Abuse. We're based here at the Gender Violence and Health Center at LSHTM. Our aim is to foster the use of the social norms approach in preventing the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. So one of the ways we do this is by organizing these regular hour-long webinars covering different aspects of social norms, structural drivers, and the sexual exploitation and abuse of young people. So for those of you joining Linea webinar for the first time, welcome. We'll be sending out a link later on if you'd like to sign up for the Linea network and receive emails about future Linea activities. We'll also include a link to the Linea YouTube channel where we post recordings for all of our webinars, such as this one today. So I'm now pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Mark Capaldi and Dorine van der Keur. Mark is the head of research and policy at ECPAT International. He has a background in human rights and peace studies. His work has been on various issues pertaining to children at risk, and for the last 10 years on the sexual exploitation of children. Much of this work has been in South and East Asia, where Mark has lived for over 20 years and where he's worked with a number of international humanitarian and development groups. Mark provides support and coordination for all of ECPAT International's research globally. Dorine is the one who is coordinating the global study of sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. Dorine is a lawyer, and she worked for 9 years in the practice in the Netherlands. But since 2002, Dorine has been working in the development world to improve access to justice for the poor and vulnerable, working with a wide array of organizations, including Legal Aid of Cambodia and UNDP Cambodia. Her work is multidisciplinary with an emphasis on child's rights. So we're very pleased to have Mark and Dorine speaking today, since they'll be presenting on the very recently released global study on sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. I know Mark and Dorine will be explaining this report in great detail, and that many of you have probably had the opportunity to read it already. So I will just say briefly that the research has now contributed the largest bank of information on child sexual exploitation in tourism to date. There's not time for them to cover all of the findings, so I'd encourage you to go and read it all if you haven't already. But Mark and Dorine are going to share specifically on the methods for the study, and then highlight some of the findings on the social factors contributing to sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism worldwide. They will also point out some of the gaps in knowledge and recommendations for future research. So the presentation is going to be followed by about 30 minutes of question and answer time. Okay, thank you. That's it for me. I'm really happy to be joining the Linea team and also on this webinar with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mark and Dorine now, who are going to begin the presentation.
So this is Dorine van der Keur, and next to me is Mark Capaldi. I will start by saying thank you very much for attending this webinar. We are delighted to present to you the global study on sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. I will call that in short from now on SECTT. And I will first introduce the global study on SECTT by explaining its background, the methodology used, and its limitations. So in the body of our presentation, Mark will discuss the role social norms play in increasing vulnerability of children to SECTT. And finally, I will conclude this webinar by presenting the most significant recommendations from the global study that are closely linked to the context of social norms. So the global study on SECTT is funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands and was initiated 2 years ago by ECPAT International with the aim to provide a clearer picture based on current evidence outlining the global nature of SECTT and evolving trends and provide recommendations for collective action. 20 years ago, the issue of child sex tourism was for the first time acknowledged as a global issue at the first World Congress against the commercial sexual exploitation of children in Stockholm, Sweden. Since then, the context in which children are sexually abused in travel and tourism has been utterly transformed. But our understanding of the latest developments, new dimensions and effective responses has remained limited at best. The global study provides evidence to guide future policies and decisions on the protection of children against SECTT. The global study was coordinated by ECPAT International and guided by a high-level task force that included 8 members. We feel very fortunate to have the former Special Rapporteur, Dr. Najat Ma'ala-Majid, as the chair of the task force, along with other top representatives from different sectors and stakeholders, and in particular those from the travel and tourism industry. As you can see, we also have Dr. Taleb Rifai, the Secretary General of the World Tourism Organization, who was willing to accept a membership of the task force. The study brought together 67 partners in total, and they produced a number of 2,500 pages of expertise and experience. And most of these contributions will be published on the Global Study website. And here you see, and the next slide, you see the homepage of the Global Study website, and you can also see the Global Study website address. So please feel free to go on there and look at what has published so far. The study used 5 complementary methodologies to capture all facets of SECTT, and relevant evidence and data were drawn from 9 regional reports by commissioned researchers, 15 country-specific studies by ECPAT member groups, 42 papers by invited partners and experts, and 9 consultations with in total 288 key stakeholders from governments, academia, and the travel and tourism industry. And then we organized 10 youth consultations. They're the most important stakeholders of all, so children and young people. And in total, we were able to have 395 children and young people between 8 to 25 years old participate in these consultations. Now, together, all of these reports and papers formed the basis for the global study report itself. And based on the research output of 2,500 pages, an analytical framework and the main findings and key recommendations were developed. And these were presented to 20 experts in a meeting in Paris in October in 2015. And later in that week, we had a meeting where the high-level task force validated these findings and recommendations. The global report was then launched in Washington, D.C., in Thailand, and in South Africa, all on the same day, on the 12th of May. The results of this first comprehensive global study on SECTT are 7 main findings and 46 recommendations. Now, rest assured that in this presentation we will limit the presentation of the recommendations and also the findings to what it seems most relevant to the theme of social norms. Before we go to the findings on social norms, I would like to point out the limitations of the study. So first of all, we have 3 limitations. First of all, that the regional research reports relied mostly on secondary data, so there were desk studies, and it was therefore difficult to always assess the quality and the reliability of the secondary sources. However, the regional reports were peer-reviewed by experts from the field. And then the second limitation was the lack of uniform methodologies for the country reports. We did develop research protocols and guidelines, and we asked the ECPAT members groups and partners to follow those for their country reports. But in reality, a lot of different methodologies were used, and thus it was very difficult for us to compare the data of the country reports. This is with the exception of the 4 studies that were conducted in Africa, and they were there was hands-on technical assistance provided by Child Frontiers that coordinated these 4 studies closely. And then the third limitation was the lack of statistics. The very nature of SECTT makes it hard to quantify, and the study faced challenges in relation to statistical data. There are few concrete or verifiable statistics on the commercial sexual exploitation of children in general, or on SECTT in particular. And this coincides with a far wider lack of data on the poorest and most vulnerable children, who often remain invisible in official statistics. Data gaps hinder the measurement of both the scale of the problem and the impact of the interventions. We only have statistics and data backing up the increased risks of SECTT, and this is because of increase in travel, diversification of travel and tourism, and the internet that is linked to the crime. On that basis, supported by the findings based on qualitative data in the global study, we concluded that the risk for children to fall victim to SECTT has increased in the past 20 years. Also, we were able to collect some indicative statistics from the study that I thought would be interesting to share. So here you see some alarming indicators. And for instance, I won't read them out all, but as you can see in the right bottom corner of the slide, that 16,100 child sex offenders are currently registered, or this was in 2015, in the Australian National Child Offender System. So all these data give some indication of that this is indeed a big problem. Now I will hand over to Mark Capaldi, who will talk about the findings regarding social norms.
Thank you, Dorine, and good evening, everyone. So what I'm going to do then is share with you some of the significance of social norms that from the global study, from the regional reports, from the country reports, that we were able to identify contributed to the increased vulnerability of SECTT. As a starting point, I think we need to explain that the global study found that there is no typical child victim. Any child can become a victim, but clearly some children are more vulnerable than others. Of the social norms, those around gender inequalities, traditional practices, and power imbalances were found to specifically contribute to the vulnerability of SECTT, and we'll look into those more closely. While abroad, travelling child sex offenders often feel a sense of anonymity and social distancing from their ethical and social norms in their own countries. And in many countries, denying or turning a blind eye to issues of sexual exploitation of children often leads to reinforcement of existing social cultural taboos and low reporting of the crime. So what we'll look at first is socially constructed gender roles. So clearly, gender has a significant impact on children's vulnerability to SECT-T. Constructions of femininity and masculinity affect what is considered appropriate behavior, what is encouraged, and what is stigmatized. Often, males are seen as biologically requiring more sex, while social norms identify females as passive objects of male sexual desire. So as a result, this means that girls are the main target of sexual predators, although the global study did find that boys are also strongly affected. The study suggests that in some regions, boys are nearly as likely as girls to be victims, and in a few countries, they are the victims of choice for traveling offenders. For example, in the regional report on South Asia, it showed that boys appear to be more exposed in public spaces. Social norms in the region often mean that boys experience a higher degree of freedom than girls, and thus boys are more likely to encounter child sex offenders through interaction. If we now look at power imbalances, gender inequalities also perpetuate the risk of power imbalances in society. Again, male dominance perpetrates gender discrimination that increases the vulnerability of girl victims of SECT-T. And we found this link in the South Asian region, where male preference is prominent, also in relating to customs such as dowry payment, labor opportunities. So this increases the vulnerability of girls as they are less favored in terms of nutrition, education, or other opportunities. Another gender-related expectation in many cultures is that while girls should remain virgins until marriage, boys are free to gain sexual experience. The Latin American report suggests that such power imbalances may be found in various social spaces. This perception of masculinity and virility often regulates the relationships and social interaction between men and women, which is associated with the idea of women being more passive and an object of male desires with no right of her own. In many Latin American countries, the practice of paying for sex with children continues to be normalized based on such a hegemonic masculinity model. Finally, we would like to stress that many traveling sex offenders opt for having a sexual encounter with a virgin girl. For example, in much of Asia, myths around virginity have fueled offenders' desire to have sex with a virgin, who may be a young child. In the East Asian report, for example, we found the preference for virgins appears to be consistent among East Asian tourists and travelers in the region. Virginity seeking is also reported to be highly prevalent in the Philippines. The demand for virgins in Southeast Asia was found to be driven largely by Japanese, Korean, and Chinese traveling child sex offenders. And for example, this was because it was often noted that some Chinese men value sexual relations with virgins because of the belief that the act would be rejuvenating or could bring good luck to a planned business venture. If we look at cultural norms and traditional practices, we can see that these dictate socially acceptable forms of relationships that are sometimes closely tied to the occurrence of SECT-T and the vulnerability of children. As we know, cultural norms are commonly accepted rules in whatever society we live in. And in terms of relationships, society often dictates what it views as, in inverted commas, correct sexuality, generally the one between men and women. But since many cultures do not accept homosexuality as a socially acceptable form of relationship, families can then reject homosexual or transgender children for fear of social denouncement. And this may drive these children onto the streets and increase their vulnerability to exploitation by tourists, travelers, and criminal networks. As was reported in the Middle East and North Africa report, girls are also more likely than boys to suffer a lack of education due to social norms and traditions that deem education more important for males than females. And this is often due to the practice of early marriage, and this can prevent girls' schooling and is a major cause of school dropout. What was of great concern is that in some communities in the regions where child marriages are permitted, we found that girls were married to travelers who have visited or stayed in those communities for relatively short periods of time. And then finally, under this area, I would like to touch upon issues around racial and ethnic differences between offenders and their victims. Racialized images of the other may influence how victims and offenders relate to one another. They influence how offenders perceive their victims, but also what victims expect from offenders. Often beliefs about foreigners' influence, particularly those engaging in transsexual sex, and how we understand perpetrators. The Brazilian report, for example, found that victims sometimes see foreign offenders as people who can offer marriage, professional growth, or the opportunity to leave the country and to gain financial security. In these cases, families do not often acknowledge SECT when the perpetrator is offering financial support. If we look at changing social norms, this is an area of particular interest which seems to be emerging and was one of the newest trends found in the global study and the regional reports. Changing social norms among children and peer pressure have also contributed to a perceived normalization of sex in childhood, combined with growing pressure to obtain consumer goods. And we found plenty of evidence in the East and Southeast Asian reports, as well as in several country-level reports in Africa, that confirm this statement. Some young people willingly engage in so-called voluntary child prostitution in order to purchase goods they could not otherwise afford, or simply to receive extra cash. Most are unaware that a willing encounter can be a prelude to a lifetime of sexual violence and exploitation. In Japan, for example, this is called enjo kozai, whereby young girls have relationships with older men. And they often feel that they are in control of these relations and that they are rebelling against traditional social norms. If we now look at social distancing of traveling sex offenders, we can see how social norms can interact within a foreign environment. The global study emphasizes that travel may create a sense of anonymity amongst child sex offenders, and that the distance from their peers, from their own ethical and social norms and their informal or formal rules means that power imbalances through travel between offenders and victims often increase based on differences in wealth, age, gender, ethnicity, or class. Therefore, this form of social distancing can make it easier for offenders to detach from their victims and to disregard the other in their actions. They might cover up this crime by thinking that the money they are providing is compensation, that they are helping victims gain income, or that victims are used to it and are more mature than children in their own country. Social distancing also allows them to step away from their peers and family, who may never find out and thus not judge their actions. It is important to note that this process makes offenders cancel out the negative social values assigned to exploitation in their own process of choosing, and therefore make them feel that they can continue with their exploitative practices. Of course, we have to also acknowledge the use of information and communication technologies that nowadays potentiate some of the conditions that facilitate SECTT and are enabling its increase. ICTs may foster anonymity and social distancing of the travelling child sex offenders. Thus, in combination, ICTs make the exploitation of children harder to detect, easier to arrange, appear more normalised, and potentially unmediated and anonymous. If we now look at the role of the law, finally, then we can see how social norms influence the laws criminalising the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Most countries have laws in place that could be mobilised to protect children against SECTT. However, the lack of specific legislation on SECTT keeps this crime below the public and policy radar, playing into social norms that belittle its importance. As much as social norms impact the creation of certain laws, laws also influence social norms by defining what is viewed as acceptable behaviour in society. So when laws do not explicitly criminalise the commercial sexual exploitation of children, offenders remain unpunished and undeterred. Certain societies with no such laws in place are less likely to perceive sexually exploited children as victims. And even in countries with solid legal frameworks addressing SECTT, social norms and attitudes may still fuel social tolerance of the crime. And this undermines the protection mechanisms normally offered by communities and can lead community members to become complicit in the crime, especially if they benefit from it financially through the tourism economy. Some of the deeply entrenched social and cultural norms render secrecy, and consequently underreporting is to be expected. According to the global study, many children never report the abuses they are experiencing, and as such most delay seeking the assistance and support they need. The global study also finds an important element of effective prosecution is the capacity to deter potential offenders and reduce incidences of crime. The global study shows that at least some offenders, particularly paedophiles and preferential offenders, travel across jurisdictions with the aim to exploit children with impunity. They reinforce each other's beliefs about specific countries. Others take advantage of places where prosecution seems less likely. So those are some of the specific findings around social norms which we thought you would be interested in. I'll now hand back to Dorine for the last couple of slides where she'll discuss related recommendations.
So the global study has 46 specific recommendations, and there are two specific and technical in the context here to share. and they've been divided up to recommendations specifically to international and regional intergovernmental bodies, NGOs, national governments, and the private sector companies. But in this context, I think it is interesting to mention that there are three areas of intervention pointed out in the global study that are related directly to changing social norms, which are, the first one is awareness raising. Whether intentionally or not, decision makers and the general public tend to turn away from the realities of SECT-T, and government policymakers and the general public remain largely unaware of the extent of SECT-T. So there is a need for more information. And there's also a need to further sensitize the private sector, and then in particular the travel and tourism and ICT sectors, but as well companies that send their staff abroad on business trips. Then the second area of intervention is reporting. Members of the public are usually willing to report SECT-T, it shows in the global study, but they need adequate reporting platforms and they need to be easily available to them. So governments should not only provide adequate resources for reporting platforms such as telephone hotlines and online reporting mechanisms, but they should also tell the public about them and encourage their use. Key stakeholders should have explicit and legally binding duties to report cases of SECT-T. So also, for instance, including the travel and tourism sectors, employers who employ business travelers, and internet service providers. And then the third area of intervention is ending impunity. The global study shows that persistent impunity reinforces offenders' senses of entitlement and victims' disempowerment. So power imbalances and anonymity serve to fuel impunity. And corruption and release on bail are two major risks that lead to offenders escaping justice and thus putting more children at risk. Then I would like to conclude with the voices of victims. We made an animation that introduces the global study, and it also captures the human toll of the crime.
My first customer was a tourist named Robert. He told me that if there was anything I needed or wanted, he would buy for me. I said okay. Later on, I went out with Japanese and Korean men.
The sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism has dramatically expanded across the globe. The huge growth in international and domestic travel has increased both the number of travelers and tourists and the number of children vulnerable to sexual exploitation.
From my very first memories, I remember being sexually molested and raped by truck drivers. I grew up along the interstate that goes all across the United States, and there were truckers all along it.
And the spread of the internet and mobile technology has made virtually no place out of the reach of the predators of this heinous crime. Any child can become a victim, but children who become vulnerable are likely to be forced into prostitution at travel and tourist hubs.
I went to where all the gay bars are in Pattaya. Foreigners would chat with me, buy me drinks, and then take me somewhere for business.
I was given drugs or forced to drink, and I was taken to the truck stop.
They are contacted and groomed by pimps or perpetrators, either in person or via the internet. They may even be trafficked by family members.
The way it was all presented to me was, only special little girls get to go to adult parties, have sex, like big girls. And so I just thought this is what happened.
There is no such thing as a typical child sex offender, although they are usually male. Some may be pedophiles, but most are not. They may be foreign or domestic, young or old. They are from all over the world. They sexually abuse children because they think they can get away with it.
There's very much this sense of nothing's going to happen to me. I believe there's a sense of entitlement. There's a sense of a right to it.
Many victims are too afraid or ashamed to speak up about being abused, and witnesses seldom report, creating a sense of freedom from any legal repercussions in the minds of the offenders. And gaps and conflicts in law enforcement leave exploited children betrayed by the world as the offenders walk away from their crimes searching for the next child to violate. The impact of sexual exploitation on a child cannot be overstated. For victims, the legacy can include severe and lifelong physical, emotional, and psychological damage.
I don't like what happened to me, and I don't want to remember it. I want other children who have been victims or will become one to know my story and learn from it.
As our world becomes smaller through increased travel and the internet, we all have a role to play. Governments, organizations, law enforcement, as well as you and me, in protecting children from this horrific abuse by travelers and tourists.
It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to abuse a child. So much of this happens in public spaces, and that's really what it takes. Speaking up. We all have that voice, and we can use our voices.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Mark and I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and we welcome any questions you might have about our presentation or the global study.
Great. Thank you, Mark and Dorine. That was really interesting. I know for many of my colleagues here at the Gender Violence and Health Center, this has been a really timely report. So we appreciate your hard work on this and presenting the evidence here today. I was hoping to get us started with a question I had while reading the report and listening today. I really appreciate that the global report has done such a fantastic job of separating the findings by region, which is really helpful when talking about a global phenomenon such as sexual exploitation in tourism and travel. And one thing I was curious about is if you found, having reviewed the evidence base, that studies and researchers and partners are able to distinguish between domestic and international travelers and perpetrators, and if that's something that's been helpful in both research and programming, and if there are any interesting findings, especially when talking about social norms, something that can be so regional, if that's coming out when looking at the potential international and domestic travelers.
Yep, let me start on that. Dorine may have something to add. Yes, definitely the study showed a very significant differentiation between domestic and foreign travelers. Obviously, in the past, the focus tended to be much more on the foreign travelers and often portraying them as pedophiles. So it wasn't a very nuanced definition of these international travelers. Also, the spotlight tended to be on the foreigners again because, well, one, it was easier to spot a foreign man walking with a local child, but also because in many countries around the world, this phenomenon was perceived as a Western problem. So again, the attention tended to be on the international travelers. What the global study has found is that actually the predominant problem is domestically. It is national travelers and also sub-regional. So within countries, say within Southeast Asia or East Asia, for example. And some of in answer to the last bit of your question, some of the new trends around emerging social norms, such as the example I gave around consumerism, then this is particularly focused around the local demand for sexual exploitation of children. So within a country, it's the men of that country that are seeking out children for paid sex, but very often, of course, in a different location to where they live.
Is there anyone else on the line that would like to ask a question?
Hi, yeah. Just a quick question. My particular kind of interest is the increase that we're seeing of voluntourism with people going to work in orphanages. And I know recently in the press there's been a case of a British guy who's been convicted of sexual abuse when he was doing this very thing under the umbrella of a Christian organisation. Is this an area that you've had a chance to look into?
Yes, we when I said in the introduction that we saw that the risks for children have increased in the past 20 years, we actually were quite confident in saying that the risk has more than doubled. So there are three factors in it, and one is that travel and tourism has doubled. So from basically for the past 20 years, the travel and tourism has boomed under the development of globalism, but also because of the internet, travel and tourism has increased, and ways for planning trips have increased. So there are different pathways to organize your travel, which also has increased risks for children. But the third factor is that what you're referring to is that travel and tourism has diversified a lot in the past 20 years. So in the past 5 years, you see all these new forms of tourism popping up. And one of them is, for instance, orphanage tourism or voluntourism, but also ecotourism, slum tourism, where people from usually richer countries come into contact with people from poorer countries, or even are pseudo caregivers. So even they come in countries and they give services to children. So they come into direct contact with children, posing all sorts of dangers for children. So this has been flagged, and it will also be a key area where we feel that there was a need to give recommendations to start seriously working on this issue and to stop and prevent this issue from happening. So we have a set of recommendations that are geared especially towards this problem and this phenomenon.
Thank you. We're happy to take any other questions at this time.
Hi, this is Rebecca. And I was really curious about this issue that you had mentioned that the tourism economy, in some ways benefits. So there's sort of these perverse incentives around addressing child sexual exploitation from the perspective of the tourism economy. And I was wondering if there's been sort of success in working with that industry, or if you've sort of sensed or seen pushback because of this economic benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Good question. Again, I think if we look back over the last 20 years, this is also a key area that has changed quite significantly over the last few years. So the involvement of the private sector. When this problem of what then was called child sex tourism was being discussed, there, of course, was a tendency to sort of blame, in effect, the tourism sector. So really right from the start, there was the danger of sort of alienating the travel and tourism sector, the private sector. And so what has changed now is we have been able to bring a lot of them into the prevention work that's taken place. So one example, there are many examples, whether that's, for example, on the aeroplane, in-flight videos being shown similar to perhaps to the one we showed you today, that can raise awareness. But also the code of conduct for the sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. This is a private sector-led initiative whereby companies or parts of the travel and tourism sector sign up to 6 key principles to protect children against sexual exploitation within their businesses. And then another good sort of intergovernmental example, which is directly targeting the private sector, is that the UNWTO are working to convert their current code of ethics for responsible tourism into a convention, which states would obviously sign and ratify. And within that convention, it is planned that there are very clear standards and regulations for the private sector. So there's a whole range of different initiatives taking place, and the private sector are getting more involved. It's fair to say probably at the moment it is more the formal sector, the larger hotels or travel companies. So we're also now having to look at how we can engage the informal sector or the sort of zero-star hotels, for example. And then as we were talking about the internet and ICT, there are new forms of travel and tourism emerging there. For example, Airbnb or Uber or, other ways that, again, have developed very, very quickly, and we haven't yet had chance to look at the appropriate child protection mechanisms that need to be built in around them. So we're looking to work with those private sectors partners in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like you have to really look ahead as technology is changing and connecting people. You have to constantly kind of be ahead of that to get the safeguards in place.
Okay, I'll go ahead and ask it. So are there any thoughts about establishing a coordinating agency in countries to assist with efforts in apprehending TSO of foreign origin, so in the country they've been charged with sexually abusing the children? That's a question from Vidya.
I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but I can say that some countries have child sex offenders registries. They are already working with that. I believe there are right now 22 countries who have that. And that many countries are also using the green notices system that was set up by Interpol. And that means that if one of their convicted child sex offenders who are registered in their national registry, if they intend to travel to another country, they will notify the other country that this person is on their way. And then it's up to the receiving country whether or not they want to deny entry to the convicted child sex offender. Because, of course, this is because of sovereignty, the decision of the receiving country. So this is something that Interpol also would like to promote, that more countries in the world start using those systems, so that basically whenever a convicted child sex offender is traveling, wherever in the world, that countries will be notified and prevention measures can be taken. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, I think that is answering the question. The second comment that was posted in relation to the question was that they feel that many of the offenders are not being held accountable, as it's very difficult for police forces and local police forces and the paperwork, etc. So I think you have answered that question. Okay, so June's question was, would you be able to comment on the extent to which these children are being affected, especially in the long term? Did the report touch on that, and could you expand on that a bit?
Okay. The report did not specifically look at the in-depth at the psychological or physical harm that these children have experienced. Because we were really looking more at the enabling environment that was taking place within travel and tourism. However, there are some of the expert submissions that are on the website which do look into that, and in particular I've mentioned the ECPAT one. Certainly, though, this is a key area that ECPAT and others like ECPAT have been studying for some time. And so there is a lot of information about that. A lot of our work is looking at how we can support children that have been victimized to, if you like, become survivors. So looking at recovery and reintegration of these children. And obviously, it varies from child to child, and there's no sort of one-size-fits-all. I think the other interesting thing to mention in the context of SECT-TT is that for a certain number of the children, they may not identify themselves as victims, that they feel that they are, earning money to support their family, that they're showing their agency, that it's a decision that they've made. And so, and that can be slightly different from children that have been sexually abused within, say, the family or the community. So those children sometimes, if they don't identify as a victim, then they may be resistant to some interventions, and so very different support needs to be provided to those children to bring them along the recovery path. But as I say, have a look at the expert submission from ECPAT, and there's other material on the ECPAT website around that.
Great, thank you, Mark. We are nearing the end of our hour, but I just want to give a chance for anyone else who has a question that might want to unmute and ask.
Okay, I would like to ask a question about changing social norm in relation to consumer culture. From your presentation, you view this kind of sexual relation between children and older people as a sexual exploitation, but some other people or maybe children themselves may not see that. They may not think that this is a form of exploitation. So I just would like to hear your view on this. That's the first question. The second question, what is different between commercial sex and transsexual sex?
Okay, thanks a lot. Two very good questions. In the first case, your first question, very much related to what we were just talking about, that you are right. In some cases, these children do not see themselves as victims. They feel that they are making choices. And also in some cases, because of certain social norms, the community or parts of the community may not view such relationships or transactions as exploitation. So we have to, I think, recognize that, but the framework within which we are studying this phenomenon needs to take a child's rights approach, and we need to look at all of the issues around the best interests of the child. And so, although the child may be making these decisions, are they in the best interests of the child? And perhaps the other point I would say is rather, very often these children are blamed. They are held responsible for getting involved in SECT-TT. They are seen often as delinquent children, bad children. But again, if we take a rights-based approach to looking at this problem, then I think the spotlight turns on the demand side, on the men, and it is primarily men who are buying sex from children. So that's what I would say for your first question. With your second question, what is the difference between commercial sexual exploitation of children and sexual exploitation of children? This has been quite a debate of recent years. What is now generally accepted is that because of certain manifestations and forms of sexual exploitation of children, which may not involve a direct commercial element or remuneration that can have a commercial element, that what is now the situation is that perhaps commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC, is a subset of sexual exploitation of children. And in the key factor is within, if we call it sexual exploitation of children, we are looking at exploitation, taking advantage of a child for some form of profit or gain. So it doesn't have to necessarily have a direct commercial value. So I'm not sure if that is clear for you.
Okay, yes, that's very clear. Thank you very much.
All right, we've pretty much reached time, but we have one more question, Mark and Dorine, that's just come through, and that's from Karen, and it's asking if in the report or the evidence you were looking at, was there information given on the compensation that's possibly given to victims who are abused by travelers? If you're able to speak to that briefly, we'd be interested to hear.
No, we to be honest, we paid little attention to that. There is a section on access to justice, and of course, in the access to justice, there is a little bit said about the compensation. But it is my understanding that ECPAT is currently working on a new compensation paper that will specifically address this. So I also want to note that when you talk about victims or access to justice or compensation for victims, that it's also often a bit difficult to distinguish between victims of SECT or victims of other commercial sexual exploitation manifestations. Because for them, in the end, who are the perpetrators, it doesn't really matter in these areas. You're a victim and you're allowed, or you should have access to justice and you should have access to compensation. However, sometimes it makes it more difficult because offenders are from other countries. So you have to work across jurisdictions, and that sort of gives extra barriers for access to justice and for compensation. But that will be addressed in an upcoming new ECPAT paper on compensation for victims.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dorine. All right, we have actually reached the end, and I know some questions are still coming through. For those of you that still have questions, we're happy to connect you with Dorine and Mark after the webinar. Mark and Dorine, thank you so much for your time and for preparing this and all of your hard work on this report. And thank you, everyone, for joining in with your questions. We really appreciate that conversation during the webinar.